Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. The first rays of sunlight crept across the rooftop, revealing a city in uneasy quiet. Our group, 8 weary survivors who had barricaded ourselves atop this hospital, stood gazing over the edge. In the half-light, we observed columns of smoke drifting from distant neighborhoods. Streets that should have bustled with vehicles and pedestrians were eerily still, interrupted only by lone figures moving with stiff, unsteady motions. I, the night shift intern, exchanged an anxious look with Dr. Malik, the physician who had become our de facto leader in this crisis. We had all survived the long night in various states of tension. Tiana, a nurse's aide, huddled in the corner, anxiously gnawing at her lip. Margaret, a middle-aged woman stranded here when the lockdown began, stared across the city in silence. Derek, who had come to visit a relative, rubbed his temples as though warding off a migraine. Lacey stood near him, clutching her recently bandaged arm. A sharp piece of metal cut her the night before, though she insisted it was not a bite. Henry, a hospital volunteer, glanced around nervously, clutching a flashlight that was flickering in and out. And Sarah, a nurse who joined us in the early hours, scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of rescue. We had hoped morning light might bring us clarity or salvation, but the world below looked more lifeless than ever. Even so, we spotted renewed movement on a main street several blocks away, vehicles rolling in formation. Through the pale dawn haze, we recognized them as military trucks and jeeps, accompanied by uniformed figures. At first, a spark of hope flared among us, but that quickly dimmed when we noticed their approach. They were methodically setting up a perimeter, blocking roads in and out of the area. From our vantage point, it looked less like a rescue operation and more like containment. Sarah was the first to say it aloud. "They're here to close this place off, aren't they?" Dr. Malik nodded gravely. "We can't be sure, but it doesn't look promising." A low droning hum drifted past us from somewhere else in the city. We listened, but it faded, replaced by the ominous silence. Our group stood there, the morning sun painting us in pale gold, wishing for a plan, any plan, that might lead us to safety. Minutes passed without incident. Then a faint echo rose from within the building, a clatter of something metallic, followed by a dull crash. The sudden noise set everyone on edge. Our memories of the night, infected individuals roaming corridors, moaning echoes in the dark, remained fresh and terrifying. Dr. Malik took a cautious step toward the rooftop entrance, a heavy metal door that led down the same stairwell we'd barricaded hours ago. He pressed his ear against it, his expression troubled. "Seems like the infected are still active," he murmured. Margaret peered over his shoulder. "And we're running out of food, water too." She was right. We'd found a few snacks in a vending machine and some bottled water, but it wasn't nearly enough to sustain 8 people for long. The rooftop might protect us from direct encounters with the infected inside, but we were slowly running out of essential supplies. We decided to scan the roof again for anything helpful. Tiana ventured toward a small maintenance shack at the far corner. The rest of us spread out, checking corners and behind vents. It was Sarah, who discovered a battered old handheld radio near a cluster of old boxes. She flipped it on, adjusting the dial, mostly static. But we recognized a broken-up voice, the same automated message we'd heard through the night. "Emergency alert, zombie outbreak, remain indoors." The message cut in and out, overshadowed by crackling static. It was no more helpful than before, but at least it confirmed that some form of broadcast was still running. Suddenly the radio hissed with a different sound, a muffled human voice barely recognizable. Sarah carefully tweaked the frequency, brow furrowed. "If anyone can hear, sub-basement, exit route, sealed tunnel, hurry." We all froze. The words were faint but distinct enough. Someone was calling from inside the hospital, talking about a sub-basement and an exit route. Could that be our ticket out? We crowded around the radio, hearts pounding, but the signal dissolved into harsh static. Sarah tried to pick it up again, but no luck. Henry whispered, "Did he say sealed tunnel? There's a tunnel under this hospital?" Dr. Malik nodded. "Some older hospitals have subterranean corridors, utility tunnels, or old passageways used for maintenance or storage. It could be a way out if it's not overrun." A grim silence followed. The notion of going back inside, where the infected roamed, felt terrifying, but staying on the roof meant certain starvation if no rescue came. And with the military's perimeter forming, it seemed more likely they were trying to keep something in, namely, all of us. Before we made any decisions, Derek pointed down to the street. "Look." 2 jeeps and a large transport truck stopped at a crossroad near the hospital. Uniformed personnel hopped out, establishing a checkpoint. We watched as someone in a hazmat suit took readings with a handheld device. Another soldier quickly unrolled a concertina wire barrier, sealing off yet another street. No attempts were made to enter the hospital, no megaphone announcements, no sign that they wanted to rescue anyone. They seemed entirely focused on locking down the area. Lacey took in a shaky breath. "They're going to trap us here, aren't they?" No one answered. While the morning sun rose higher, the soldiers continued their methodical fortifications. We tried waving from the rooftop, but we were too high up, or maybe they simply ignored us. Either way, we received no acknowledgement. Finally, we gathered in a huddle near the rooftop door. Dr. Malik addressed everyone. "We heard a radio transmission about a sub-basement exit. If that's real, it might be our best shot. The alternative is waiting up here until we run out of resources." The entire group exchanged anxious looks. Going back down meant confronting the infected in the very place we'd fled. But if we stayed, the only thing ahead was slow dehydration or worse. Sarah cleared her throat. "I hate to say it, but we don't have much of a choice." Reluctantly, we agreed that we should at least explore the idea. It was decided we'd descend into the hospital, attempt to find whoever broadcast that message, and see if there really was a sub-basement corridor leading beyond the quarantine perimeter. We armed ourselves as best we could. Makeshift tools, metal rods, heavy flashlights. No real weapons. We took the last sips from our water bottles and shouldered what supplies remained. With a shared nod of determination, we approached the rooftop door. Our barricade, a loose jam of chairs and a metal rod wedged into the frame, had kept the stairwell sealed overnight. When we removed them, the door creaked open, revealing a dark and stale air within. I shone my flashlight down the steps. The smell of disinfectant still lingered, but beneath it, a faint odor that was hard to place, something musty or possibly decaying. The hospital had lost most of its power, with only sporadic emergency lights giving a weak glow in certain corridors. One by one we carefully descended, each footstep echoing hollowly. Tiana's flashlight flickered, so Derek offered to hold it steady. Our hearts pounded in unison, expecting to see the pale eyes of an infected figure at every landing. At the bottom of the stairwell, the door leading to the old wing corridor stood slightly ajar. A streak of morning light pierced through a small window in the hallway, illuminating drifting specks of dust. For a moment we listened, muscles tensed. No groans, no shuffling footsteps, just eerie silence. Margaret whispered, "So far, so good." With cautious steps, we advanced through the corridor. We recognized some of the landmarks: the pediatric waiting room, the staff lockers, and a few rows of patient rooms. The events from last night felt like a fever dream, running from infected, hearing them moan behind doors. Now the stillness felt even more unsettling. Occasionally we caught glimpses of what the infected had done: overturned carts, scattered medical tools, broken glass. An empty wheelchair lay on its side, wheels slowly spinning when we passed. More than once we spotted smudges that looked suspiciously like old stains. We tried not to dwell on it. Sarah pointed to a corridor sign, "Basement access." It directed us down a different hallway. We knew from building schematics that this route would lead to mechanical rooms, storage, and possibly the sub-basement. The hospital's older sections, rarely used, might have secrets or hazards we could barely anticipate. A distant bang echoed from somewhere else in the building, causing us all to freeze. We waited, straining to hear if anything approached. The tension was relentless. Eventually, we heard nothing more and pressed on. When we reached another stairwell door labeled Maintenance and Basement, Dr. Malik tried the handle, locked. He frowned, looking around for some way to get through. Then Tiana noticed a damaged key box mounted on the wall nearby. She pried it open, and inside, we found an old key on a rusted ring. A quick test, and the door clicked open. We descended into the basement level, which felt cooler and damper than the floors above. Faint emergency lights gave us a gloomy corridor that stretched around a corner. Overhead, pipes creaked softly. The air smelled stale, mixed with the faint tang of chemicals from cleaning supplies. As we moved further, we found a small security station, just a cramped room with monitors and a desk. Much of the equipment had powered down, but one screen still glowed faintly. The angle showed a corridor somewhere else in the hospital, though the image was grainy and marred by static. Shadows flickered on the edges of the screen, but we couldn't see if they belonged to survivors or infected. A handheld radio sat abandoned on the desk. Henry picked it up, fiddling with the knobs. A low crackle drifted through the speaker, then a flicker of a voice. "Sub-basement, exit route, you must hurry. Structural concerns." It cut off again, replaced by static. Our group exchanged hopeful looks. Henry gripped the radio. "Hello, we can hear you. Where are you?" Static answered. Then a single word came through the crackling. "Security. Room. Basement. Near main power. Help me." The signal faded out. We all looked at each other. This person, whoever he was, had knowledge of the sub-basement exit, presumably the tunnel out of the hospital, and he needed help. Dr. Malik set his shoulders. "Let's find him. This man might know exactly where the tunnel is." Stepping away from the security station, we spotted a sign indicating main power, boiler room, leading around another bend. Without much else to guide us, we followed the arrow. Down the corridor, the lights grew even dimmer. Some sections were lit only by flickering bulbs. The floor sloped subtly downward, suggesting we were nearing an older part of the structure. Occasional pipes hissed with steam, and the metallic scent in the air grew stronger. We passed a locked door labeled Boiler Control. Another door read Archive Storage, also locked. Our flashlights danced across peeling paint, revealing the stark signs of a place rarely visited. Suddenly, Margaret let out a sharp gasp and pointed. A figure lurched around the corner ahead, illuminated by a sputtering light. My heart pounded. Was it a person, an infected, or something else? We crouched behind some crates. The silhouette stopped, head tilting as if listening. Then it made that dreadful, rasping moan we knew all too well. It was one of them, an infected. Its movements were unsteady, arms twitching at odd angles. We held our breath, praying it wouldn't sense us. After a tense moment, it staggered off in another direction, disappearing into a side passage. Tiana exhaled shakily. That was close. For now we had avoided a direct encounter, but the presence of infected down here meant we couldn't let our guard down. We pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. Finally, we spotted a half-open door with light spilling out from under it. A plaque on the wall read, Security, Maintenance Office. The single overhead light buzzed softly. We slipped inside, carefully closing the door behind us. The room looked similar to the smaller station we'd seen before, but larger, with racks of old circuit boards and flickering monitors. Slumped in a chair was a person wearing a rumpled security uniform, face pale with exhaustion. At our sudden entrance, he jolted upright, eyes wide with fear. Then he seemed to realize we weren't infected. You made it, he croaked. We rushed forward. Dr. Malik knelt beside him, checking vitals. The security officer, his name tag read Rodriguez, seemed weak but uninjured aside from a few bruises. He He clutched a handheld radio with drained batteries. Rodriguez inhaled deeply. "Thank goodness. You heard my broadcast?" Sarah nodded. "We only caught pieces, but yes, you mentioned a sub-basement exit." With trembling fingers, Rodriguez pointed to a tattered map pinned on the wall, an older blueprint of the hospital's lower levels. A faint red line had been drawn, leading from the maintenance office icon to a place labeled sub-basement access and continuing off the page. Rodriguez explained in hushed tones. "It's an old supply tunnel, used decades ago. I think it might connect to a service building near the edge of the property. I came down here to find a way out, but there's a partial collapse blocking part of it. It might still be passable." Dr. Malik studied the map, expression resolute. "That's our best chance. The military is setting up a perimeter, and we're not sure if they plan to help or just seal us in." Rodriguez nodded bitterly. "From the chatter I overheard, they're under strict orders to keep the contagion contained. They've quarantined the entire area. No one in, no one out." He paused, swallowing nervously. "They mentioned a final measure if the situation worsens." Our hearts sank at that ominous phrase. No one needed to say it. A final measure could be anything from indefinite blockade to something more destructive. Rodriguez tried to rise, nearly collapsing from fatigue. Dr. Malik steadied him. "I can walk," Rodriguez insisted, though clearly taxed. We offered him water, and after a moment he nodded. "We should leave soon. More of those things roam the lower floors, and I've heard them banging around near the old boiler room. The route to the sub-basement is beyond that area." We took the battered map and stepped back into the corridor, assisting Rodriguez. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that moved with our group. Each step felt heavier, loaded with the knowledge that one wrong turn could lead us into a cluster of infected. The corridor led to a rusted metal gate, which Henry and Derek had to force open with a loud groan of protesting hinges. Beyond the gate, a staircase descended even further underground, lit by a single flickering bulb. The sign read, "Sub-basement storage." As we descended, the air grew colder, and the walls felt damper. Pipes lined the ceiling, some dripping steadily. A faint rumble of machinery echoed in the distance, though the exact source was unclear. We paused at a landing where corridors branched off in 3 directions. Rodriguez consulted the map under the weak light of our flashlights. "We go left," he whispered. The left passage brought us to a wide storage area with towering shelves of dusty supplies, bed frames, old monitors, archived paperwork. The corridor beyond had partially collapsed, leaving concrete rubble scattered across the floor. Light filtered through a crack in the ceiling. Margaret shone her flashlight on the debris. "Are you sure we can get past this?" Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, if we climb carefully. Beyond here is the old corridor that leads to the sub-basement door." We moved slowly, shifting rubble, testing footfalls. Occasionally a piece of concrete would clatter loose, echoing down the hall. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see a pair of vacant eyes staring back. Suddenly, a dull scraping sound came from somewhere behind us. We froze. The scraping repeated, accompanied by a soft shuffle. In unspoken agreement, we turned off our flashlights and crouched low. In the dim glow from the collapsed area, we saw them. 2 infected figures stumbling across the storage space, drawn to the noise of falling debris. One wore a tattered patient gown. The other seemed to be a visitor, clothes torn, face contorted with that same blank hunger. Our group huddled behind a heavy shelf, praying they wouldn't notice us. They wandered closer, slow but relentless. Every move they made set my nerves on edge. Tiana stifled a whimper as figures passed mere feet from our hiding place. At last, the infected turned away, heading deeper into the storage area. We waited until their steps faded, then resumed our careful climb over the rubble, hearts pounding. Every second spent in the sub-basement felt like borrowed time. Beyond the collapse, A heavy metal door loomed, rusted but still intact. Faint light shimmered under its frame. The words, "Authorized personnel only," were stenciled across it in chipped paint. Rodriguez leaned against the door, listening. He then tested the knob. Locked. "There should be a keypad on the other side," he said quietly. "But the only way to get there might be to pry this open. The map shows an alternate route, but that corridor collapsed years ago." Henry hefted a crowbar he'd found in the maintenance office. "Let's see if we can force it," he offered. It took all of us, working in tense silence, to wedge the crowbar into the seam and push. The metal creaked, and the entire door shuddered. We paused each time we made noise, fearful of alerting more infected. Finally, with a tortured screech, the lock snapped and the door inched open. A draft of stale air rushed out, carrying hints of mold and damp concrete. We slipped inside, sealing the door behind us as best we could. The space beyond was a long tunnel, with overhead lights that flickered weakly, likely drawing from a fading emergency generator. Old supply crates lined the walls, some marked with dates from decades past. Rodriguez pointed. "That way. The end of this tunnel leads to a sealed hatch that, in theory, opens to the outside." We followed the tunnel, stepping over bundles of cables and collapsed shelves. The hum of machinery grew louder, though we couldn't identify the source. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at a thick metal hatch set into the far wall. A wheel-like mechanism was fixed at its center. Rodriguez examined it by flashlight. "This is it. If we open this, we'll be outside the hospital perimeter, or at least into the service building on the other side." Relief flickered across everyone's faces. We might finally escape. Tiana reached for the wheel to turn it, but froze when a shrill siren-like sound cut through the air. For a moment, I thought it was the hospital alarm. Then we realized it came from above, echoing down the tunnel. Derek tensed. "What is that?" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "It might be the military's perimeter alarm, or some sort of lockdown alert." We heard faint, distant announcements through what sounded like a loudspeaker. We could only pick up fragments. "Containment? Remain in place, final measure." My skin crawled. The words "final measure" repeated in my mind. Dr. Malik stepped forward. "We need to open this hatch now." Sarah swallowed hard. But if the entire area is on lockdown, the exit might lead us right into the path of the military. And if they consider us infected, what then? No one had a good answer. Our only hope was that they'd see we weren't among the infected. The alternative was staying in the hospital and risking whatever final measure might entail. We spun the metal wheel. It groaned, rust flaking off in our hands. The mechanism resisted, seemingly frozen by years of neglect. Derek, Henry, and Dr. Malik combined their efforts, straining until their arms shook. Slowly, the wheel gave, turning inch by inch. An eerie rumble vibrated through the tunnel. Overhead pipes rattled, and dust sifted down from the ceiling. I looked up, alarmed. Was the structure failing, or was something else happening in the hospital? Rodriguez aimed his flashlight at the far end of the tunnel, half expecting the infected to appear at any moment. The corridor remained empty for now. With a final heave, the wheel completed a full rotation. The hatch hissed, then popped open a crack. Stale outside air trickled in, carrying a faint whiff of grass and something burning. Carefully, we pulled the hatch open, revealing a dimly lit space beyond. Lacey peeked through. "It's another corridor. Looks like a utility building." We hurried through, helping Rodriguez step over the threshold. On the other side, we found ourselves in a windowless room lined with pipes and wiring, clearly part of a service building that connected to the hospital grounds. A battered metal door stood on the far wall, presumably leading outside. Hope sparked again, but it was tinged with apprehension. We had no idea what awaited us beyond that door. The room itself was cramped, lit by a single fluorescent tube that flickered overhead. Water dripped from a broken pipe, forming a puddle on the floor. Someone had scrawled a warning in faded paint on the wall. "Keep shut. Quarantine." It looked old, possibly from a previous crisis or drill, but it still made our group shiver. We approached the metal door that presumably led to the open air. Its small reinforced window was fogged with condensation. As we inched closer, we heard faint mechanical sounds and the low hum of idling engines from outside. Could that be the military? Or maybe a generator? It was impossible to say without risking a look. Henry carefully wiped at the condensation on the window. He squinted through, then turned back to us. I see a fenced-off area. It looks like some sort of storage yard with a high chain-link fence. Dr. Malik nodded. If we're within the fenced perimeter, we might still be trapped. Margaret took a shaky breath. But we might be able to find a gap or a way around. Anything's better than going back. We gathered our courage. With a collective push, we opened the metal door. Sunlight flooded in, brighter than we expected, making us squint. The service yard stretched out before us, a cracked concrete lot scattered with shipping containers, dumpsters, and old mechanical parts. A tall fence encircled the area. Beyond it, we could see the silhouettes of buildings, some partially obscured by the smoky haze lingering in the air. The air carried the echo of distant sirens and the sharp tang of burnt materials. We stepped onto the concrete, glancing around warily. The yard appeared deserted. No infected stumbled about. No soldiers were visible. For the first time in what felt like ages, we were outside. Freedom? Possibly. But the perimeter fence loomed, topped with barbed wire. We needed a plan. Rodriguez slumped against a container, catching his breath. We should see if there's a gate or a gap. Sarah pointed to a far corner where the fence dipped slightly. Let's check there. We crept along the edge of the yard, staying alert for any signs of movement. The ground was littered with debris, broken pallets, scraps of metal, cracked asphalt. A hollow wind rustled through the fence links. When we reached the corner, we found a chain-link gate fastened with a heavy padlock. No immediate gaps. Henry tested the fence's strength, solid. Suddenly, a rumble overhead made us jerk our gaze skyward. An aircraft flew by, low and ominous, trailing a faint hum as it vanished beyond the skyline. Tiana spoke in a trembling whisper. Are they monitoring the area? No one answered, but we all suspected the same thing. The military had air support, and if the lockdown was absolute, we needed to escape before it was too late. While we were debating how to handle the locked gate, the radio on Rodriguez's belt crackled to life again, startling us. Static hissed. Then a distant authoritative voice cut through. Attention all units. Perimeter confirmed. Await orders. Repeat. Final measure authorized if containment fails. All personnel stand by. Our group stared at each other, hearts pounding. The phrase final measure made our blood run cold. We'd heard it before, but now it was spoken with unmistakable resolve. Rodriguez shook his head. They're preparing for the worst. Dr. Malik compressed his lips into a tight line. That might mean they're going to neutralize everything inside the quarantine zone. Lacey swallowed. We have to get out now. There was no time to lose. Derek yanked at the padlock, trying to see if it had any weaknesses. Henry hunted around for a tool to break it. Our best bet was a heavy piece of metal piping. We took turns striking the lock, each clang echoing across the yard, spiking our anxiety. If there were infected nearby, the noise might draw them. If there were soldiers, they might hear it too. But we had no choice. After several tense swings, the lock's shackle snapped. The gate clattered open. We quickly scanned the street beyond the fence. It appeared empty, though the haze and drifting smoke limited our view. Without hesitation, we slipped through, leaving the yard behind. Now, in broad daylight, we found ourselves on a side street flanked by old warehouses that belonged to the hospital's extended campus. Faint shadows moved far down the road, though it was hard to tell if they were survivors or something else. Rodriguez motioned for us to stay low. If the military is actively monitoring, they'll be patrolling major streets. We might avoid them by moving through back alleys. We nodded and proceeded carefully along the abandoned roadway, weaving around deserted vehicles and piles of debris. The city felt like a ghost town, broken windows, abandoned storefronts, and an unsettling quiet only interrupted by the occasional distant siren or faint moan. We managed a few blocks without incident, skirting the edges of the quarantine zone, when we heard hushed voices echoing from a loading dock. We froze, hearts racing. Were these more survivors? Or possibly people with malicious intent? Dr. Malik carefully stepped forward, calling out in a controlled tone, "Hello?" A surprised gasp came from behind a stack of pallets, then a hesitant voice, "Don't come any closer." We cautiously raised our hands, showing we meant no harm. A moment later, a small group emerged, 3 individuals, each looking tired and frightened. One of them wore a torn jacket with a small patch that read, "Volunteer EMT." They studied us warily, as though expecting hostility. Sarah took the lead. "It's okay, we just escaped the hospital. We're not infected." One of the strangers, a young man, nodded slowly. "We've been hiding here since yesterday. The entire city is—" He trailed off, running a shaking hand through his hair. "We heard about a zombie outbreak, but it all happened so fast." We quickly shared our story, explaining that we'd come through the sub-basement tunnel. The strangers let their guard down. They warned us that the main roads were heavily patrolled by soldiers who turned away or detained anyone trying to pass. Others had reported that a few outposts of infected roamed side streets. Tiana exhaled. "So we're stuck between the military and the infected." "Pretty much," one of them replied grimly. "We were hoping for a rescue, but it doesn't look likely." After a hurried discussion, the strangers decided to join our group. We were stronger in numbers, and we all sought the same goal: escape from the quarantine zone. We suspected the perimeter might be less guarded further out, so we developed a plan to push deeper into the industrial district and circle around the main barricades. Time weighed on our minds. That ominous final measure could happen any minute. Helicopters occasionally buzzed overhead. More than once, we spotted dark shapes crossing distant intersections. Were they infected? Soldiers? We couldn't be certain. Moving carefully, we navigated through cramped back alleys and side streets. The city's architecture felt like a maze, every turn a potential risk. Occasionally, we glimpsed crows perched on toppled telephone poles or the roofs of abandoned cars. Their cawing echoed hauntingly. We reached a narrow stretch lined with concrete walls on either side, a sort of service road behind a row of commercial buildings. Halfway down, we ran into trouble. 5 figures appeared at the other end, stumbling over debris. We recognized the stiff gait. The infected. Their hollow gazes locked onto us the moment they sensed movement. Our group backed away, but behind us came another figure stepping out from a broken fence, blocking our retreat. We were cornered. Dr. Malik hissed, "Stay close, keep moving." With nowhere else to go, we pressed forward, hoping to slip past, but the infected advanced, arms outstretched. A chorus of low, ragged moans filled the alley. Henry held a metal pipe defensively. Others raised whatever they had, flashlights, crowbars, anything to keep the creatures at bay. We edged along the right side, trying not to be trapped against the wall. The first infected lunged. Henry swung the pipe, forcing it back. 2 more shuffled in from the left. Panic soared as we realized how outnumbered we were. Yet, in their slow, uncoordinated approach, we found small openings to maneuver around them. Sarah guided Margaret and Tiana, while Derek helped Lacey, whose arm still throbbed from her injury. Rodriguez stayed near me and Dr. Malik, making sure no one got isolated. We weaved through the mass of swaying figures. A few clutched at us with frantic hands, but we managed to evade, only sustaining minor scratches on clothing. Adrenaline surged in my veins. A strangled moan tore at my ears as an infected figure lunged from behind a trash bin, narrowly missing Tiana. At last, we burst out of the alley, hearts pounding, breathing fast. Miraculously, we'd made it through without anyone getting pulled down. Looking back, we saw the infected milling about near the alley's entrance, as though unsure how to keep following. We wasted no time putting distance between us. Our path led us to the outskirts of the industrial area, where we spotted tall fences and barricades in the distance, likely part of the military's containment line. Rows of concrete barriers blocked major roads. Military vehicles idled behind them, a few soldiers patrolling the perimeter with watchful eyes. Rodriguez exhaled. "We're in a no-man's land now. If we try to cross the barricade directly, they might see us as a threat." Margaret looked around anxiously. "Is there a quieter way out?" We scanned the area. To our left stretched a rail yard. Beyond it, the city opened into suburban neighborhoods, presumably also under quarantine. On our right stood more warehouses and supply depots. The perimeter line curved around, forming a rough circle or blockade. A few soldiers paced the barricade. We couldn't hear their words, but they appeared tense. A single loudspeaker repeated instructions we could only catch in fragments. "Remain in place. Do not attempt to breach. Containment." Derek sighed. "If we can slip through a gap, we might avoid direct confrontation, but if we're seen, we might be mistaken for the infected." Dr. Malik glanced at Rodriguez. "Is there any ID or pass we could show them to prove we're not infected?" Rodriguez shook his head. "I lost my badge in the hospital, and I doubt that would change their orders." We lingered behind a parked delivery truck, weighing our options. The world felt on a knife's edge. The final measure hung over our thoughts like a storm cloud, each minute ticking by. A loud klaxon suddenly blared, resonating across the barricades. Soldiers scrambled. Over the loudspeaker, an urgent voice rang out. "All units alert. Multiple breaches in the southern quadrant. Possible large-scale surge. Prepare for engagement." We couldn't see the southern quadrant from our position, but we imagined a wave of infected overrunning a section of the perimeter. Soldiers rushed to reinforce it. Engines roared as trucks repositioned. Henry took a shaking breath. "This might be our chance. Some of them left this area to handle that breach." Sarah nodded. "Then we should move quickly." Keeping low, we slipped through a side street running parallel to the barricade. Our hope was to find a section of fencing that wasn't heavily guarded. We passed piles of broken pallets and shipping containers, forging ahead until we spotted an opening, a gap in the chain-link fence that someone had attempted to repair hastily. The repairs looked incomplete. Through the gap, we could see a deserted road stretching into the distance, flanked by tall grass. It was beyond the official barricade, though no telling if it led to safety. We hurried over. At the fence, we discovered it was held together by loose wiring. The opening was just wide enough for us to squeeze through one at a time if we bent the chain link carefully. Dr. Malik and Derek worked fast to pry it apart, creating an impromptu doorway. Margaret slipped through first, followed by Tiana and Lacey. Henry helped guide them. Next went Sarah and Rodriguez, though Rodriguez struggled a bit, drained by his earlier ordeal. Finally, Derek and I wriggled through, leaving Dr. Malik last. Just as he was halfway, we heard a yell from behind us. A soldier, not more than 50 yards away, had spotted us. He raised an arm, shouting, "Stop! Remain where you are!" Instinctively, Dr. Malik ducked, pushing himself free of the fence. The soldier hesitated, apparently unsure whether we were infected or survivors. Another soldier rushed forward, weapon raised. The first soldier spoke into a radio, presumably calling for backup. In that moment of confusion, Dr. Malik scrambled through, and we ran down the deserted road, hearts pounding. The soldiers hesitated to fire, possibly unwilling to risk harming uninfected civilians, but we couldn't rely on that mercy for long. We sprinted until our lungs burned, slipping behind overgrown shrubs and the remains of a collapsed billboard. The road curved, leading us behind a stand of trees. Only once we were out of direct sight did we pause, gasping for breath. Rodriguez sank to his knees, exhausted. Margaret clutched a stitch in her side. We regrouped in a makeshift circle, each scanning the surroundings. Birds chirped in the distance, a strangely normal sound in the midst of chaos. Sarah whispered, "I can't believe we made it this far." But we knew we weren't truly safe yet. If the quarantine extended beyond the city limits, there might be additional checkpoints. And if the final measure was indeed something drastic, the city behind us was on the brink of devastation. Derek turned to Dr. Malik. "Now what?" Dr. Malik brushed sweat from his brow. "We find shelter, and we keep moving. We need supplies, transportation if possible. Maybe we can get far enough away that the military perimeter won't matter." No one could guarantee that plan would work, but we nodded. The alternative, lingering near the barricade, seemed even more dangerous. As we ventured farther along the deserted road, we caught glimpses of other sections of the quarantine zone in the distance. Blocked highways, lines of military vehicles, columns of smoke where fires burned unchecked. A disquieting sense of finality lingered in the air. At one point, we climbed a small rise to get our bearings. From there, the skyline of the city was fully visible. It looked eerily serene under the mid-morning sun, yet we knew the streets below were teeming with infected. Beyond the barricades, we could see scattered columns of black smoke rising from places we couldn't identify. Then, just when we thought we had a clear path, an earth-shuddering boom echoed from deep within the city. We whipped around to see a plume of dust and debris rising near the central area, possibly near the hospital itself. My heart twisted. Had the military begun some kind of systematic demolition? Tiana stared with trembling lips. Did they just... No one answered. The scene spoke for itself. Another explosion reverberated moments later, accompanied by a cloud of debris. Were they targeting the largest clusters of infected, or systematically destroying key structures? Dr. Malik looked grim. It might be the beginning of that final measure we feared. We pressed on with renewed urgency, following the road as it wound through a neglected industrial park. Old factories loomed, their windows shattered, their parking lots choked with weeds. Evidence of quick evacuation lay everywhere, discarded gear, overturned dumpsters, half-loaded vehicles, but no living souls were in sight. We managed to find a small convenience truck abandoned near a shipping dock. The keys were still inside, but its engine refused to turn over. Frustrated, we abandoned it and kept moving. Every step away from the hospital felt oddly bittersweet. We had escaped the immediate nightmare of the locked-down building and its infected halls, but the city's fate still loomed over us. We'd left behind the place where we had huddled together through the darkest hours, forging bonds in fear and desperation. Now, with the shockwaves of explosions resonating in the distance, it was as if we had fled a sinking ship. Margaret brushed away tears. There were still people in that hospital, the unspoken truth. We couldn't save them all. Some might have found their own way out. Others, tragically, might have remained trapped. After what felt like hours, we reached the outskirts of the industrial zone. Ahead lay more suburban areas, houses, yards, winding streets. The horizon opened up, less cluttered by tall buildings. We could almost imagine normal life if we squinted hard enough. Could we slip through and find open roads? We paused in a patch of shade, exhausted and thirsty. Our meager water supply had run low. No one complained, but the strain was clear in every face. At least we had put distance between ourselves and the barricades. Suddenly, over the quiet suburban sprawl, we heard a faint hum. It was different from the military aircraft we'd heard before, some smaller engine. We scanned the sky. A small aircraft, possibly a news chopper or private plane, cut across the horizon. For a moment, it circled an area far from us, then continued on its path. The mere sight of something airborne, not clearly military, stirred a flicker of hope. Maybe the outside world was still functioning somehow. We gathered in a loose circle at the edge of a weed-choked parking lot, the sun now high overhead. One by one we took stock of our supplies. A few first aid items, some scattered energy bars, nearly empty water bottles, and the clothes on our backs. Our group, myself, Dr. Malik, Tiana, Sarah, Margaret, Derek, Lacey, Henry, Rodriguez, and the 3 newly met survivors, was alive, if barely. But the future looked grim. Rodriguez lowered the radio. No new signals, just static. The main broadcast might still be repeating somewhere, but we have no idea how big this quarantine zone is. Dr. Malik set a reassuring hand on Rodriguez's shoulder. "We'll keep moving, find a safer place. Maybe we can contact someone outside the city limits. It's our only option." Silence fell as we watched the skyline behind us. Occasional pops and distant thunder-like booms suggested the military was taking extreme steps to contain the zombie outbreak. Whether they'd succeed or turn the city into a wasteland, we couldn't guess. Slowly, we turned our backs on the ruin of our once familiar world and began walking away, uncertain what the next hour or day would bring. Each of us hoped we might find rescue beyond the quarantine, or at least a place to regroup. Our final measure was simply to keep going, together. We had made it out of the hospital, surviving the horrors within its locked-down corridors and sub-basement tunnels. But in a city besieged by infected and sealed under military control, our journey was far from over. The road ahead was fraught with unknown dangers, scattered survivors, and an ever-expanding crisis that threatened to consume more than just one hospital. Somewhere, an emergency alert continued to broadcast warnings of a zombie outbreak spreading beyond the hospital. We could still hear it echoing in our minds, if not on every radio frequency. The question remained, how far would it spread, and would we ever truly escape it? Our fate, like that of so many others, hung in the balance, caught between the infected's relentless advance and the military's tightening noose. We kept moving, step by step, into the uncertain light of day, carrying the fragile hope that beyond the barricades, beyond the final measures, there might still be a chance at survival. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.